When law enforcement officers encounter something they can't explain, something that defies their training and experience, it shakes them to their core. A San Diego sheriff's deputy pulls over a terrified psychiatrist who's carrying a loaded .44 Magnum to protect his family from something he calls Zoobies, and they're destroying his property. Two Pennsylvania police officers seeking a relaxing weekend at a remote hunting cabin are instead surrounded by vocalizations that circle their camp in the darkness. In this episode, I'm going to take you through two cases that prove even the most skeptical trained observers can come face to face with the unexplainable. I'm Josh Dinocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. Late one night in 1970, a San Diego County Sheriff's deputy was patrolling a dark mountain road when he pulled over a car that would lead him into one of the strangest cases of his entire career. The deputy's name was Doug Huse, and he'd only been with the San Diego County Sheriff's Department for about a year at this point. He joined in 1969, and by March of 70, he'd been assigned to patrol a small town called Alpine, which sits about 30 miles east of San Diego, right up in the mountains. Doug worked the overnight shifts, which meant that he'd spent most of his time driving these winding, empty roads through the Cuyamaca Mountains, basically just watching for drunken drivers or broken down cars or anything else that might need attention in the middle of the night. Now, Alpine was not exactly a hotbed of criminal activity. It was this quiet little mountain community where not much happened, and most nights, Doug's shift were pretty uneventful. He'd drive around, check on businesses, maybe help someone with a flat tire, but that was about it. On this night, in late 1970, Doug's partner was driving their patrol car when he spotted a vehicle heading eastbound that caught his attention. There was something about the way it was moving, maybe it was weaving a little bit, that made him decide to pull it over. And so, he flipped on his lights and the car pulled over to the side of the mountain road, and Doug and his partner got out and approached the vehicle, flashlights in hand. This was standard procedure. One officer on each side of the car. And as Doug's partner reached the driver's window and started talking to the driver, Doug could see the man inside looked really nervous. His hands were shaking as he reached for his wallet. The driver, well dressed, looked to be in his 40s, and when he handed over his license, the officers saw his name was Richard Bedore. The address on the license showed he lived right there in Alpine. Now, Doug's partner was going through the routine questions, where are you coming from, where are you headed, when suddenly Richard blurted out that he had a gun in the car, and not just any gun, but a fully loaded .44 Magnum with a 6-inch barrel. Immediately, both officers tensed up. In those days, finding someone with a loaded handgun during a traffic stop was not common, especially in this community, and a .44 Magnum, well, that's a serious weapon. It's designed to stop very large threats. So Doug's partner asked Richard to keep his hands on the steering wheel while Doug went around and carefully retrieved the weapon. Sure enough, there it was, a massive revolver fully loaded. Now, carrying a loaded firearm in your vehicle wasn't necessarily illegal, but it definitely raised questions. Why would someone need that kind of firepower driving around Alpine at night? So Doug's partner asked Richard straight out, "Why do you have this gun?" Richard's answer was something neither officer expected. He looked at them right in the eye, completely serious and genuine, and explained he needed it for protection from the Zoobies. Doug and his partner just exchanged glances and they're like, "Zoobies? What in the world is that?" Richard must have seen their confusion because he quickly added that he was a psychiatrist and he had a practice in San Diego and that he lived here in Alpine with his wife and 2 kids, a 13-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter. He wasn't some lunatic. He was a medical professional. But he insisted he needed that gun because of what was happening at his property. Now, at this point, Doug was thinking they might be dealing with someone who's on the verge of a mental health crisis. Here's a psychiatrist talking about needing a loaded .44 Magnum to protect himself, but Richard was very lucid. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't on drugs, he was just terrified. And the officers decided not to arrest Richard or confiscate his weapon, but they were definitely curious about what was going on. So they told him to be careful and, they sent him on his way. They didn't really have a way to understand the interaction, but they would soon enough. And that wasn't the end of it either, and not by a long shot. Over the next few days, Doug couldn't stop thinking about that traffic stop. Because his job had been so routine at this point, stopping a psychiatrist and having them tell you that they needed protection from Zoobies is so left field. Well, Doug and his partner decided to do a little investigating on their own time, and they found out that Richard had actually purchased a ranch property in Alpine not too long ago. He'd bought it from an elderly German couple who'd lived there for years. The property was located on a small road about a third of a mile off Alpine Boulevard, kind of tucked away with only about 4 or 5 neighbors nearby. It had fruit trees, an apple orchard, and there was even a stream about 3/4 of a mile behind the property. It sounded like a perfect place to raise a family. But Doug and his partner also heard some strange rumors about the property. People in town said weird things happened out there. Nothing specific, just weird things. So one night during their shift, Doug and his partner decided to drive out to Richard's property just to check it out. And as they turned onto the small road leading to the house, the first thing they noticed was the lighting. Every single exterior bulb on the property, the porch lights, the lights by the garage, everything was yellow. Not white like normal bulbs, but yellow. And so they pulled up and Doug could see it was a nice place. It wasn't run down. It didn't look ratty. It was just a single-story ranch home. It was well-maintained, with the apple orchard visible off to one side. But there was something else that he noticed. The fence around the apple orchard looked like it had been recently repaired. In fact, it looked like sections had been completely rebuilt. Doug and his partner knocked on the door, and after a moment, Richard answered. He recognized them immediately and actually seemed relieved to see them. And so he invited them in, and that's when Doug got to hear the full story. And folks, it was absolutely bizarre. Richard told them that when he'd first bought the property, the previous owner, that elderly German man, had pulled him aside and given him a very specific warning. He explained that whatever you do, do not, and I mean do not, change the yellow light bulbs to white ones. Keep them yellow. Richard had thought this was strange, but the old man was deadly serious about it. And at first, Richard had humored the old man and left the yellow bulbs, but after living there a few weeks, he decided it was just all silly superstition, that it couldn't possibly be true. And so he wanted regular white lights like a normal house. So he went around, replaced every single bulb with a white one, and that's when the activity started. The very first night after he changed it, Richard and his family were awakened by a thunderous crashing sound. Richard grabbed a flashlight, ran outside thinking maybe a tree had fallen or something, but when he got to the apple orchard, he found that the entire fence around it had been torn down. Not just damaged, I'm talking completely destroyed. There were posts ripped out of the ground and boards scattered everywhere, and Richard figured it must have been vandals, maybe kids causing trouble. So he spent the next day rebuilding the fence, making it even stronger than before. But the next night, the same thing had happened. The fence was destroyed again. And this went on for several nights in a row. Richard would rebuild the fence during the day, and something would tear it down at night. But here's a really strange part, is that Richard never found any tire tracks. There were no footprints. There was never any evidence of tools that had been used. It was like the fence had simply been torn apart by hand, but that didn't make sense because the amount of strength it would require. But Richard noticed something else weird. Apples were going missing from his orchard, but only from the very highest branches. We're talking 10 feet up or higher at least. The lower branches were oddly untouched. Richard tried looking for ladder marks. He looked for broken branches where someone might have climbed, but there was no evidence to support that. It was like something tall enough to reach those high branches were just walking through and plucking apples off the top. Richard's family also started noticing this horrible smell at night, and it would kind of just drift through the property. It was this awful stench like rotting garbage mixed with wet dog, and it was so bad they'd have to close all the windows, and even then, the smell would sometimes seep in. One morning, Richard's wife found her brass wind chime, which was very heavy and solid, that hung from their porch, completely flattened on the ground. I mean, like something had stepped on it and crushed it. Richard also kept chickens on the property, and he had this sturdy chicken coop that he'd built himself. And one morning, he went out there to feed the chickens and found the entire coop had been shifted off of its foundation. And keep in mind, this thing weighed hundreds of pounds, but it hadn't been moved several feet. And there were strange tracks around it. He tried to make sense of the tracks, but they didn't look like anything he'd recognized. They were too big to be human and wrong in shape to be a bear, and they only had 4 toes. It gets even more terrifying. One evening when he was inside the house, his wife was in the kitchen and Richard was in the living room when he heard his wife's voice from outside calling the chickens. You know, she was saying, "Here, chickie, chickie, here, chickie, chickie." And Richard thought this was odd because his wife was actually in the kitchen and he could see her from where he was sitting. So who was outside imitating his wife's voice? He quickly grabbed a flashlight and he ran outside, and the voice stopped immediately. And so he searched around the chicken coop really quick. He looked everywhere, but he didn't find anything. Just strange 4-toed tracks in the dirt. After weeks of this, Richard was at his wit's end. He tried everything, staying up all night to watch, setting up tripwires, and even mounting cameras around the property. But whatever was causing these disturbances seemed to know when it was being watched. I mean, the cameras would malfunction, or the film would be ruined, or simply nothing would happen when he was actively monitoring. And then one night, Richard's family finally saw what was causing all the issues. It was around 2 a.m, and Richard's teenage daughter woke up because she had heard noises outside her window. And she peeked through the curtains, and there in the apple orchard, illuminated by the moon, was this massive creature. And she said that it was covered in dark hair and was standing upright like a person, but much taller, probably around 7 feet. And it was reaching up with these really long arms, plucking apples from the branches and eating them. And the daughter was frozen in terror by watching this because she just wanted to scream and wanted to wake up her parents, but she couldn't move. She just watched as this thing ate apple after apple, and then, as if it sensed her watching, it turned and looked directly at her window. And she said its eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's eyes would, and then it simply turned and walked away on 2 legs, not 4, and was gone. When she finally managed to wake up her parents and tell them what she saw, Richard didn't waste any time. He grabbed his .44 and he went outside, but it was already gone. All that remained were more of those strange 4-toed tracks and the stripped apple branches. After that night, the sightings became much more frequent. Richard's wife saw it near the chicken coop one evening, and his son saw it walking along the tree line. Richard himself finally got a good look at it one night when he was trying to protect his own chickens. What's really interesting is that Richard never once used the words Bigfoot or Sasquatch or even ape or gorilla when he was recounting his experiences. He just, for whatever reason, called them Zoobies. I don't know why, and he said them, because Richard claimed there wasn't just one, that there were 3. Now, also according to Richard, there was a large male that stood about 7 feet tall and a smaller female that was maybe 5 feet tall, and this is what really was mind-blowing to Doug. There was a juvenile that was maybe 4 feet tall. Clearly a family unit. And Richard explained that he'd seen all 3 of them together one night moving through his property like they owned the place. And the way they were described, they weren't exactly like, Bigfoot. They didn't look like, a typical ape would. They had very human-like features. Doug had asked Richard if he'd reported this to anyone besides the police, and Richard said yes. Actually, a researcher named Ken Kuhn had come out to investigate. And this was a guy who wrote for Saga magazine, and he was very interested in Richard's story. He'd already spent time on the property, he looked at the tracks, interviewed the family, and was convinced something genuinely strange was happening there. In fact, he'd written about it in the July 1975 issue of Saga magazine, though he'd had to change some names and details. Richard also showed Doug something that he'd kept, a plaster cast he'd made of one of the footprints. And this thing, folks, was huge. About 14 inches long and wider than Doug's size 12 shoe. But again, the strangest part was that it clearly showed only 4 toes, and the shape was very strange as well. broad at the front but narrow and pointed at the heel, like whatever made it was designed for gripping rather than just walking. So, Doug held that plaster cast in his hands, and he's feeling the weight of it, looking at these 4 clear toe impressions, and he didn't know what to think. Richard was obviously an intelligent, educated man, but he was also a practicing psychiatrist with a family and a reputation to maintain. What's he going to tell the public? Why would he make something like this up? Well, you guys tell me. Richard wasn't the only one who'd had experiences either. Doug and his partner started asking around discreetly, and they found out that there had been other sightings in the area. Go figure. There was a place called Proctor Valley Road, about 30 minutes from Alpine, down near the Mexican border. People had been reporting something they call the Proctor Valley Monster since at least 1947. According to local historian Wendy Wilson, the legend started when 2 middle school boys found a mutilated calf on Proctor Valley Road. The calf had been torn apart in a way that didn't match any known predator, and there were also strange tracks around it. Since then, people had reported seeing this hairy creature in the area, especially near the vehicle crossing at the border. Even more interesting is the Native American connection. The Vejas Native Reservation was just north of Interstate 8, not far from Richard's property. And the Vejas people had legends going back generations about the same type of being, a giant hairy man who protected their sacred burial grounds from intruders. Those burial grounds, well, they were located about 2 miles north of Richie's property. Doug's partner became a bit obsessed with this case, and on his days off, he'd take his son out to Richard's property and, they'd stake out, hoping to see something. They'd sit in their car all night with binoculars and cameras, watching and waiting, and a couple of times, they heard strange noises, like wood knocking or bizarre howls unlike coyotes or mountain lions, but they never saw the creatures. Richard, meanwhile, was taking more drastic measures. He'd installed motion sensor floodlights all around. He figured if these things didn't like white light, then maybe bright white floodlights would keep them away. And strangely enough, it seemed to work. After Richard installed the lights, the activity on the property decreased dramatically. The fence stayed intact, the apples were left alone, and the awful smells became less frequent. The beings, whatever they were, seemed to have moved on. Doug kept in touch with Richard over the years, and by 1991, Richard was still practicing psychiatry in downtown San Diego. He told Doug he was planning to write a book about his experiences with the Zoobies, though Doug doesn't know if that book was ever published. Doug himself would share this story publicly for the first time in 1992, more than 20 years after that strange traffic stop. By then, he'd already heard similar reports from other deputies who'd worked in the East County area, and even from counselors at the juvenile detention center who'd heard kids from the mountain communities talking about seeing the hairy people in the woods. To this day, Doug doesn't know what to make of it all. Was Richard's family really being harassed by a family of unknown creatures? Were they seeing bears and letting their imagination run wild? Or was there something else going on entirely? What Doug does know is that Richard Baddour was genuinely terrified of something. Terrified enough to carry a loaded .44 Magnum, and terrified enough to completely change his property with floodlights. The creatures, called Zoobies, were never photographed, never captured, and never proven to exist, unfortunately. But the plaster cast ended up in Peter Gattilla's book, The Bigfoot Files, where it remains one of the most unusual pieces of evidence of all time. In late September of 1996, a police officer named BC was driving through the backwoods of Clinton County, Pennsylvania, with his friend, who happened to be the chief of police in their department. The two men had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. They were both exhausted from their demanding jobs, dealing with the usual chaos that comes with law enforcement, and they just really needed to get away from all of it. Their destination was a remote hunting cabin about 3 miles down Beaver Dam Road, in an area called Beaver Dam Hollow near Hammersley Fork. The cabin had this quirky name, Camp Hit or Miss, which had been given to it years ago by the hunting club that owned it. Now, even though this was a hunting cabin owned by a hunting club with multiple members, BC and his friend weren't going there to hunt. They were just going to relax, do some target shooting with their firearms they'd brought and basically decompress from the stress of their job. Around mid-morning, after navigating the winding dirt roads that led deeper and deeper into the Pennsylvania wilderness, they finally pulled up to the cabin, and it was exactly what you'd expect from a remote hunting camp. A simple wooden structure surrounded by dense forest with a small porch out front. The whole area was incredibly peaceful and quiet, which was exactly what they were looking for. Now, this cabin was rarely used outside of bear season and deer season. So when BC and his friend arrived, it had that musty smell of a place that had been closed up for a while. But they didn't mind. They unpacked their gear, got settled in, and then went about making themselves comfortable. They built a fire in the old stone fireplace, cooked up some lunch, and then they spent the afternoon doing exactly what they'd come there to do: target shooting. They'd brought along a bunch of tin cans, which they set up on logs and fence posts around the property, and then they just spent hours plinking away at them with their firearms. It was therapeutic in a way, just focusing on marksmanship without any of the pressure or stress of their daily lives. The entire time they're there, these are just two guys having a good time, occasionally ripping on each other about missed shots and just enjoying the getaway. The area around the cabin was an incredible mix of different terrains. There were massive laurel thickets that grew up to 15 feet high in some places, with just such a high density that you couldn't see through them. And then there were stands of pine trees with kind of a similar situation. Visibility was limited to maybe like 10 feet because how close the trees grew. But there were also these open growth areas where you could see for hundreds of yards. And the whole region was crisscrossed with creeks with fresh water. And, the forest floor was littered with beech nuts and acorns from all the hardwood trees. It truly was a beautiful place. As the day got later and it turned to evening, BC and his friend cleaned up their makeshift shooting range, put away their firearms, and settled in. After making dinner and talking about work, they decided to step out onto the porch to enjoy the night air. Now, it's important to understand that neither of these men had been drinking. They hadn't touched any alcohol, they didn't have any intoxicants, and of course they're officers. So let's give them the benefit of a doubt that they were also completely sober. As they're standing there, just talking, both of them heard something. From across the hollow on the opposite mountain came this vocalization, and it wasn't like anything either of them had ever heard. It was so incredibly loud, unnaturally so, for how far away it seemed, that it didn't make sense. And it was persistent. And it wasn't just one call or cry, it kept going. It was this long, drawn-out sound that seemed to echo through the hollow itself. BC would later struggle to describe it, but he knew immediately that it wasn't any animal he was familiar with. And remember, these were two experienced outdoorsmen who had spent plenty of time in Pennsylvania, which means they were familiar with the sounds of elk, bear, mountain lions, and this just didn't match any of those sounds. As they're listening to this noise, they realized something, that the sound began to move. And over the course of about 15 or 20 minutes, whatever was making the vocalization traveled from its original position across the hollow to somewhere behind their camp. It was like it was circling them, but staying far enough away that they couldn't see it. BC and his friend were very worried at this point, and they're both thinking the same thing, that what the heck is this thing? And so they strain their ears a little harder, and they're trying to listen for anything that might give them a clue, footsteps, branches, anything that would let them know what this is, but it was just deathly silent. All they could hear was this otherworldly vocalization just traveling through the darkness. And to make matters worse, it seemed to intentionally keep its distance from the camp, and it never came close enough for them to get a visual on it, even though the sounds were so loud that it felt like it should be right on top of them. Now, for two officers who were used to dealing with very tense situations, this was uniquely unnerving. And in their line of work, they were accustomed to confronting problems head on. And if there was a threat, you identified it and dealt with it. But this was so different than what they were used to because they couldn't identify it, they couldn't see it, and they could barely even explain it. So all they knew to do was to stay out on the porch for a while, their weapons close at hand, and they just kept watching and listening. And eventually, the vocalization stopped and the forest returned to its normal nighttime quiet. They then decided to go back inside. As you can imagine, neither of them slept well at all. They kept expecting to hear the sounds again, but it never came back. The following morning, BC was so determined to find an explanation for what it was they had heard. As soon as it was light enough, he headed out to explore the area where the sounds had originated. And he was thinking very logically, right? He's looking for tracks, scat, broken branches, anything that might give him a clue about what had been out there. And so he had spent hours just combing through the area, through all the dense laurel thickets and massive rocks, and through the hardwood groves where the sound had first emerged. It drove him crazy because he couldn't find anything. And even looking down at the ground, there was no signs of any large animal moving through the area. There were no tracks. There was no evidence at all. It just didn't make sense. Now, even though both men finished out their weekend at the cabin, the relaxation that they had sought was pretty much ruined. Now, due to the nature of this event, when they got back to civilization, they both agreed not to talk about it much. They were police officers, and they dealt in facts and evidence, not mysterious sounds. Well, fast forward years later, and BC came across audio recordings made by a researcher from Ohio. And these recordings were of supposed vocalizations, and when BC heard them, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It was the same sound, or at least similar enough that it brought him right back to that night on the porch of Camp Hit or Miss. To this day, he has never heard anything like it before or since. And his friend, who eventually retired from police work, went into private security and still doesn't like to talk about that night. And because you guys have made it this far, I want you to all comment below badge believer. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.